ancient city of Nineveh, a place originally inhabited by the Sumerians of Mesopotamia. Researchers did something that sounds impossible. They took the DNA of the Sumerians, the people who invented writing and built the first cities on Earth, and laid it directly beside the DNA of ordinary Iraqis living on that same land today. It was supposed to be a formality, one last stamp on what every textbook had promised for 100 years. It wasn't. The results came back wrong in a way nobody was ready for. Music and the tidy old stories started to fall apart, because hidden between those two genetic codes was the truth about who the Sumerians really were and where their blood actually went. Stack up all of HLA group J, and it accounts for nearly 85% of every paternal line in the sample, about 96% of that being J1. In plain terms, this is one of the most homogeneous paternal groups ever recorded in the entire region. Most populations are a messy mosaic of fathers. This one is almost a single thread, concentrated right up to the edge of purity. Picture a normal city's worth of men as a deck of cards shuffled 1,000 times. Music, every suit, every number, all jumbled together. Now, deal 100 hands and watch almost every single card come up the same. That doesn't happen by accident. Something squeezed an entire population through a needle. But the concentration isn't the eerie part. The eerie part is where the thread begins. To find where a lineage started, geneticists look for where it's most internally varied, because a line collects the most mutations where it has lived longest. Map J1, P58 that way. And its center of gravity isn't in southern Iraq at all. It sits up north in upper Mesopotamia and southeastern Turkey, with faint threads reaching toward Oman, the Ethiopian highlands, and the eastern Mediterranean. The main paternal line of the people closest to the Sumerians doesn't start where the Sumerians ended up. It looks like it walked in from the north and came down the rivers. If pulling a vanished people back out of the blood of the living is the kind of music thing that keeps you awake at night, hit subscribe right now, because everything past this point is this channel reading the dead out of living veins. And it only gets stranger. Those faint threads matter too. A line that stretches from southeastern Turkey out toward Oman, and the music. And if they were a mixture, where is that mixture now? The living mirror? The written accounts etched into stone suggest the Anunnaki were giant beings standing 8 foot tall who came to Earth. It's not in a museum, and it's not underground. It's walking around Iraq today. Iraqi DNA is the mirror, a living archive where the Sumerians are still smoldering under 4,000 years of history. But it's messier than the Marsh Arabs. Among the Marshmen, the paternal line is almost a single thread. J1, P58 at nearly 3/4 of everything. Zoom out to Iraq as a whole, and it spreads wide open. J1 drops to around 31%, while lines nearly absent in the marshes show up strong. J2 around 24%, R1 groups around 21%, and a branch called T at 6.5%, almost non-existent among the Marsh Arabs. Where did music, those strangers, come from? Later history. In the 4,000 years since the Sumerian city-states fell, the land swallowed wave after wave. Adians, Amorites, Assyrians, Babylonians, then Persians, Alexander, Greeks, Arabs, Mongols, Ottoman Turks. Each dropped a new layer of genetic sediment, J2 and R1, filtering down from Anatolia and the Iranian plateau. Stack those, music, waves up, and modern Iraqi DNA starts to look less like a single people and more like a riverbank. Layer over layer of sediment. Each invasion laying down its own band on top of the last. Slice a clean section through it, and you can almost read the history like tree rings. The oldest core near the bottom, Adian and Babylonian above it, Persian and Greek above that, Arab and Ottoman near the top. Every layer is real, and every single one of them is younger than the foundation it's resting on. And here's the detail that raises the hair on your arms. Those incoming lines lean overwhelmingly male. About 30% of Iraqi Y chromosomes carry traces from far-off regions. But in the mitochondrial DNA, the mother's line, that figure drops to roughly 9%. The conquerors and traders who poured and were mostly men. The women stayed, anchored to the land, carrying the ancient Mesopotamian core forward century after century, while empires rose and burned out on top of them. Conquest after conquest left fingerprints on the Y chromosome. But the deepest, oldest signal, the one that survived every invasion, came down through the mothers who never left. That's what makes the mirror so valuable. Peel off the later layers, the J2, the R1, the T, and underneath in both ordinary Iraqis and the Marsh Arabs, you find the same foundation, the native Middle Eastern J lines, plus the maternal haplogroups HJT, and you that have sat music in Mesopotamia since the Neolithic. The Marsh Arabs aren't a separate people. They're the most concentrated dose of the same core every Iraqi carries. And it isn't only them. That same root turns up among the Assyrians, the Iraqi Jews, and the Mandans. Communities split by religion and language, but sharing one bloodline underneath. Modern Iraqis are the memory in the mountains. For thousands of years, Sumerian myth kept pointing east to a far highland where the gods lived and the gifts of civilization came down from. For a century, scholars filed it under religious poetry and moved on. But the genetic trail now points the same way the myths always did. East toward the Zagros, toward the place a part of their ancestors actually came down from. I have to be honest, this is still speculation, not proven fact. But it's the kind that raises the hair on your neck. Maybe those mountains were never metaphors. Maybe they were memories burned into myth and passed down across hundreds of generations. The exact place a piece of their bloodline first set out from. Maybe the Sumerians spent 4,000 years trying to tell us where they came from. And we're only now, through DNA, learning how to hear it. A memory older than every empire that ever ruled that land. Older than the alphabet. Older than the wheel. Carried not in a book, but in the shape of a story told to children, surviving long enough for a lab to confirm it. We may never prove it, but the fact that we can even ask and that the genes don't laugh it out of the room is its own kind of unsettling. And yet, before any of this can be called finished, there's still one piece missing. The most important one of all, the missing piece. This story isn't finished, and it can't be. Not yet. Everything traced so far, the J1, P58 fingerprint, the flow out of the Zagros, the three-way mixture was built from proxies from the DNA of the living. The single most important piece is still missing. We've reconstructed the genetic story of the people who invented writing almost entirely without their actual remains. Everything you've heard is an inference drawn from their descendants, a portrait sketch from the faces of grandchildren 40 centuries removed. It's remarkable that it holds together as well as it does. It's also exactly why it could be torn down tomorrow. To truly nail it, science needs the one thing it has never had. DNA from the Sumerians themselves, lifted straight out of southern Mesopotamia, music out of Eridu, out of Uruk. And that's where it hits a wall. Not a wall of stone, but of history and bad luck. The sites that could settle this lie under modern cities or inside lands wrecked by decades of war or behind dig permits frozen for years. And even if someone broke ground tomorrow, the old enemy is still down there waiting. The hot, wet climate that ate the DNA in the first place. And even the rescue technology cuts both ways. The same music advances that now let labs read whispers of DNA from a single tooth also raise the bar for a clean ancient Sumerian genome. You need to sample the heat hasn't already shredded, recovered without a speck of modern contamination, from a grave you can actually prove belonged to Sumer, music, and not to one of the dozen peoples who lived on that exact ground afterward. That's a very short list of ifs. And southern Iraq has spent 4,000 years making every one of them harder. So the word crawls quietly, no headlines, changing everything one footnote at a time until one day you look up and the textbook has quietly become a different book. That's the real lesson buried in all of this. These discoveries don't shut a door, they kick one open. For 2 centuries, we try to jam the Sumerians into a box, outsider or native, pure or mixed. But what ancient DNA keeps screaming civilization after civilization is that the boxes were never real. The Sumerians weren't pure. Neither were the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Chinese. Nobody who ever called themselves a people was ever a solid block. They were all layers of older people stacked over thousands of years. The Sumerians are just the clearest case because they invented writing and used it to tell us their own story. Which drags us back to the question that started all of this. How does a civilization that big vanish without leaving a single cell behind? They never left. We asked it wrong from the very first second. The Sumerians hid their bodies. Sure, the climate handled that. But hiding your body isn't the same as leaving. Maybe they never left at all. Empires fell. Cities sank into mounds of dirt. Their language died and got replaced. Akkadian, then Aramaic, then Arabic. And the name Sumer faded out of living mouths until nobody called themselves by it anymore. But the blood didn't die with the name. It didn't evaporate with the language. It stayed in the people still building reed houses in the marshes, in the Assyrians and Mandans guarding ancient faiths, in millions of Iraqis alive right now, with the core of those first writers still echoing in their veins. Run that backward, and it lands somewhere strange. The person stuck in traffic in Basra this afternoon. The kid kicking a ball down a Baghdad alley. The fisherman pulling a reed boat through the marshes at dawn. Some of them are carrying unbroken the same deep signal that was already ancient when the first scribe pressed a reed into wet clay. They never read a single tablet. They are the tablet. The Sumerians didn't die. They changed their name. They changed their tongue. They dissolved into the endless flow of the same land they always called home. That's a different kind of ending than the one we usually mourn. We picture lost civilizations as ruins, as silence, as something the desert swallowed whole. This one wasn't swallowed. It was absorbed, still out there in the bloodstream of a living country, riding under 100 newer names, breathing in people who have no idea they carry the oldest signature in the written world. And that might be the most disturbing, most beautiful truth in the whole story. A civilization can lose everything, its temples, its empire, its language, even its own name, and still refuse to disappear. Because as long as there are people living between those two rivers, the Sumerians are still there, quiet, patient, waiting for us to finally learn how to listen. So tell me in the comments, which lost civilization do you think never truly vanished? Music, but is still hiding in the blood of people walking around today? I want to hear it. And if this rewired the way you see the first cities on Earth, subscribe because the next buried story is already coming and you don't want to find out about it secondhand.